Welcome to In Reality, the podcast about truth, disinformation, and the media. I'm your host, Eric Schurenberg, longtime journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Now, one of the hard things to face about the news ecosystem at this time is that no one is coming to rescue us. There will be no Clean Air Act to scrub the fabrications and misconceptions and provocations out of our tragically polluted news feeds. If you want to consume news in a healthy way, not be misled, not trap yourself in a bubble, but better understand the world at this moment, you have to take the initiative. On your own, it's up to you. Now, this is not, God forbid, an exhortation to do your own research on social media. That'll drive you deep down some rabbit holes. But it is an exhortation to think clearly, effectively, scientifically about what you read or watch or listen to develop the best possible picture of reality. Our guest today is Michael Starbird, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of Texas with a specialty in the abstruse field of topology. Starbird realized that the best way to teach students math was to teach them how to think. His book, The 5 Elements of Effective Thinking, is about developing the habits of mind that not only make you better at calculus, but also make you better at understanding what information you can trust. Michael and I talk about how to judge scientific claims when you're not a scientist, as most of us aren't, why no idea is permanently true, and why being open to change is the quintessential element of effective thinking. Now here's Michael Starbird. Michael Starbird, welcome to In Reality.
Thank you.
It is great to have you here. Now, as you know, on In Reality, we talk a lot about media and the information environment. How does the news get made the way it does and get served to you the way it does? What are the problems affecting the flow of trustworthy information? But that's kind of largely a supply side issue. There's also a demand side to the information exchange. That is, what all of us consumers of news, how we receive it, and maybe the best defense against being misled by false information is to think critically. Now, you call it effective thinking, which is maybe much better branding, but I and the others in the misinformation world might call it making yourself foolproof. But whatever you call it, it's all about using your own thinking habits to help you identify reliable information so you have the best ability to make good decisions about your vote, about your beliefs about fellow Americans, about your health or your money.
Yeah.
Now, you are, as we said in the intro, a much beloved and much decorated math teacher at the University of Texas. And your key realization was that students struggling with math could get better at math by getting better at thinking.
Yes.
And that's the inspiration for your book, The 5 Elements of Effective Thinking, which you wrote with Edward Berger. So we'll dive deeper into those 5 elements, but just to get us grounded, let's list them here. Just tell us what the 5 elements are with just a sentence of description.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to deviate from your question a little bit to tell you a little about the background of the 5 elements, where they came from. I was asked by a friend of mine to construct a course in mathematics for wonderful honors liberal arts students. And I finally came to realize that they're not going to use the mathematics per se in their everyday lives. They're going to be leaders of society, but that's not the fundamental contribution I could make to their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I finally, and by the way, it took several years of mistakes before I learned this. It occurred to me, I need to be giving them some contribution from this experience that they can use every day in their lives. And that changed the whole shift of the course to saying, well, what can I teach them that will allow them to do exactly what you just were talking about, make better decisions in their lives, become more successful at everything they do, be able to tell misinformation from reality. So it shifted the entire concept of what my goal of this course was. And the effect was to say, okay, I want their experience in this mathematics classroom to really help them to become better thinkers and be better able to navigate every single moment of their lives. So that changed the entire focus of the course. And one of the challenges for me was that I had to become specific about, well, what are the intellectual contributions I can give to my students by virtue of this experience in a mathematics class? And that's what led to these 5 elements of effective thinking. That was, we had to say, well, exactly what is it that we think is useful for a person, how to use their minds in ways that make them more successful and more able to differentiate reality from bogus things.
Okay,
So,
good.
yeah. So those are the, that's sort of the background that I think might frame this discussion.
Okay, great. Well, thank you on behalf of all liberal arts grads. Thank you for making that pivot. I've often thought that consuming news and sort of understanding your environment through the media environment, understanding reality through your media environment, is kind of very akin to mathematical and scientific thinking. So,
Sure.
all right, now that we know the background
Okay.
of the 5 elements, let's go through them.
Okay, so the first one, and perhaps, and I don't like to rank them, they're all my children, and so I don't want to be prejudiced, but probably the most fundamental one is to understand simple things deeply, is the way I phrase it. What I really mean by that is to understand fundamentals deeply, to understand the basics of every single aspect of one's environment, particularly in your own expertise, to return frequently to the very fundamentals of that most expertise, with the idea that as you push your best skills forward, returning to the basics of your whole subject matter really causes you to see those most advanced issues in a different light.
Okay.
So,
All right.
that going back to fundamentals repeatedly, not just once, not getting very good at fundamentals and then moving on, but repeatedly returning to fundamentals of your discipline or your skill.
Good.
And of course, this is a famous one for athletes, for example, or dancers or artists returning to fundamentals. So that's number one.
Sure. Doing scales, as it were, to use
Doing
the
scales,
analogy.
exactly.
The second one is
The second one is to our phrasing is it, which is a cute double entendre, fail to succeed. So this one is making mistakes. It's not the mistakes that lead to success. The mistakes themselves are not beneficial. What's beneficial is to allow the mistakes, by analyzing the mistakes, to let them become directive toward better choices. So it's taking the mistakes and saying, well, what have I learned from those errors, and then use those to push forward. So that's number two. So the third one is to raise questions. And this is a practice of mind that, first of all, makes life much more interesting. Because every time you hear somebody speak, every time you read something, you ask the questions such as, where is the evidence for this? Where did this come from? What are the implications of this? Where is it going to? And then that leads right into the fourth one. And by the way, I should say that the most fundamental of those, the raising questions, is asking yourself, what is the real question? What is the real question? And this is just framing that question for whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish can often be illuminating and shocking, frankly, sometimes. Okay. The next one is follow the flow of ideas. So this is just the idea that every single human thought that we have, we think of this as things that are natural. Probably not. If we lived 30,000 years ago, what you and I are thinking in our minds right now would not have come up in the minds of our ancestors. So every idea that humanity has developed over time is the end of a process up to this moment. and
Mm-hmm.
realizing it's the end of a process that came from somewhere before, and that continues, so that we're in the middle of a stream. All of us live our lives. I like to think of it as we're living our lives in the middle of a movie, right? The movie of human experience, and we're born right into the middle of it. We live our lives, and it continues. And having that perspective of things changing, and that we're in the middle of that flow of ideas, changes how it is we think about our world. And the final one is change. That the idea of actually viewing ourselves as a work in progress, that we are not going to be the same people in a few years as we are now. When I think about teaching, I'm not thinking of taking my students and adding some knowledge. Instead, I'm trying to create different human beings. Rather heady concept. And
Right.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Michael, it implies that your responsibility as an adult is to continue to see yourself as a changing human being, as a work in progress.
That's why I just got out of my tennis lesson this morning. So,
Oh, you're changing your backhand, are you?
yes, yeah, top swing backhand, and it's a problem. Let me just say.
Well, yeah, welcome to the club, brother.
Right.
All right, so let's go back to element one. So understanding the simple things, the fundamentals deeply. Now, as I apply that to the information ecosystem and sort of understanding what it is that you're consuming as a news consumer, I think you need to kind of understand what it is you're looking at. Are you looking at a reported article or an opinion piece, or you need to deeply understand the standards of this particular writer or the institution that the writer represents, the sourcing, all that kind of stuff. When you are not a journalist, though, and you're kind of trying to understand deeply the fundamentals of this kind of information exchange, the other side of the exchange, how do you go about that? Sort of what's your advice there?
Well, for one thing, every issue that is presented in what's called news has a couple of basic problems. One is that it's a summary. It's a very small summary. I'm in the university, and I study what I study deeply. My knowledge, I'm in a subdiscipline of mathematics. When I do research, I'm in three-dimensional, geometric topology. This is a little arcane area, and it's extremely rich, wonderfully interesting, and full of interesting things. I appreciate the fact that any significant issue has a background to it and has a depth to it that an article in saying what happened yesterday is not capturing. So the idea of being aware that any news article has a depth to it that you're not seeing is significant. So let's take, for example, let's suppose you're reading about vaccinations. Well, for one thing, there's science. How do vaccines work? Do you actually understand how they work? And the answer is no. By the way, for me, the answer is no. I don't really know. I have friends who have spent their entire lives studying how vaccinations work and vaccines work that I can ask. And I have an appreciation for the depth of knowledge and the strategies that are used to come to the insights that scientists come to. So I have an appreciation for what's involved in making a conclusion about anything that makes me view a news article as a, frankly, mostly superficial summary of a little tiny piece of a big story. So that's that. So one of the things is, for example, if I'm interested in a particular thing, is to read about the history of it and to try to understand if it's a scientific thing based, try to get some appreciation for what the science actually is behind that. But of course, that requires effort. and that requires expertise. And I like to see bigger pictures of things. For example, in the case of news, I often ask myself the question: suppose news sources were produced instead of every few minutes, suppose they were produced every 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have quite a different view of what's happening. You wouldn't be concerned with, who said some stupid thing yesterday. Instead, you might look and say, how are people living now compared to 50 years ago? And that gives a totally different view of what the trajectory of humanity is and has been.
Elaborate on that, Michael. So 50
Yeah.
years ago, the life expectancy was much shorter than it is now. There were many more people living in deep poverty. There were sort of fewer technological distractions to people's behavior. But what is that analogy, or what does that kind of mental exercise come up for you? What does it say to you?
Well, to me, I guess it's a perspective creator.
Mm-hmm.
It says that as humanity has progressed, and by the way, I happen to believe in progress. I think human beings over the long periods of time, measured in hundreds of years or in decades, that we are in fact progressing. That progressing on many fronts. And I like to think that we can look at data to make that persuasive. Just as you pointed out, when I was a kid, more than 50% of the population of human beings on the planet lived at the most severe poverty level that exists. Things like $1 a day equivalent kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
where any bad weather caused a famine and people just died. Now that number is 8 or 9%. What an accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
We should be we meaning humanity should be celebrating that incredible positive step that we have taken with respect to that particular issue. And as you say, things like life expectancy, children's mortality rates, vaccinations. 80% of 1-year-olds on the planet are vaccinated with something.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, it's shocking that, for example, the anti-vaxxers in this country it's really quite amazing that that kind of thing is a reality for our moment in history. But historically speaking, we meaning human beings are making huge progress. That's demonstrable by evidence.
Michael, let me drill down a little bit on vaccines
Sure.
since you brought it up, which I expected you to. I will, honestly speaking, not research mRNA vaccines, and I will have to make a judgment about whether I or my loved ones should get vaccinated based on mediated information,
Correct.
probably from reporters quoting people that they tell me are experts.
Correct.
Do you have a kind of shorthand, given the 5 elements of effective thinking, for making judgments about, deeply scientific, expert, abstruse questions that nevertheless have an effect on daily life?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm glad you mentioned this, Eric, because it's just simply true that it's not practical to become an expert at any of these difficult questions. And so all of us are relying on hearsay, unless you're asking me a question about topology, it's hearsay. My view is hearsay, as is any non-expert. But the thing that I know, because living as I do in a world of the scientists, I know what it means for a scientific article to appear in a very respected journal.
Mm-hmm.
And I know what is involved in getting a scientific advance stated and accepted by the scientific community.
Mm-hmm.
So since I have a very direct understanding of the process, the peer-reviewed articles, the sense of community that people are interacting, the very stringent requirements for getting a paper accepted into one of the leading journals, it's really rather impressive. It's reviewed by many experts and so on. So the point is that I have an appreciation for the scientific process, and therefore I have confidence in which sources are actually very likely to be correct and which ones aren't. In the case of vaccinations, in the case of COVID vaccinations, first of all, it was amazing that the vaccinations could have been created that quickly. And everyone involved in making that happen should be applauded for that. The idea that people, and I actually wrote about this, it's really shocking that of the 1.2 million Americans who died of COVID up to now, about 330,000 of them died after vaccines were available for free to them and known to be safe and efficacious. 330,000. Now, to put that number in perspective, there were 58,000 Americans killed in the 10-year ordeal of the Vietnam War. So more than 5 times as many people died of unnecessarily from COVID. The other ones, people were dying because we didn't know what to do. That's understandable. But the idea that many people have died unnecessarily it's interesting to me that people aren't, we should be crying about this. It's a tragedy, and it's not those individuals' faults. Let me make that 100% clear.
Yes, there definitely is some blame to spread around there about people who prospered from misinformation around that. Let's move on to mistakes, because there's a kind of natural segue, I think. Your point, the reason mistakes are learning from mistakes is part of the elements of effective thinking, is that people have to recognize that making mistakes are part of the process of increasing knowledge. You cannot do that unless you learn from mistakes. You try things, some fail, and you learn from them.
Right.
Journalists make mistakes. Scientists make mistakes. For example, for a long time, we were convinced that a daily glass of red wine was good for you. Right. Fortune magazine, when I worked there, we put that claim on the cover. And so now we believe that, no wine is good for you, however frequently you drink it. A lot of people, however, conclude from those mistakes, those missteps, that you can't trust science at all, or journalists. What conclusion should we draw from kind of obvious, prominent pratfalls like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you got to understand that, this is sort of a mathematical theme, that if an assertion is made that, say, red wine is good for you or red wine is not good for you, how good? How big a difference does it make?
Mm-hmm.
I don't drink, but I love chocolate. So any article that says dark chocolate is good for me, I'm all over that. But I also realize, what is the actual effect? Is it how significant is the claim? And by the way, switching from one side to the other may be just a tiny switch to say, oh, well, it's more, it's not really that beneficial, or it's a little beneficial to some people. Human beings are different from each other. Some people who have some physiological issue for which whatever the effect is of red wine, maybe it's beneficial to some people and not beneficial to others. It's a realizing there's a distribution of humanity, and that little tiny effects, if you study thousands and thousands of people, little tiny effects can use the phrase correctly, statistically significant, and yet be not significant whatsoever. And so appreciating that distinction is important. And by the way, I have no idea about the red wine. I haven't studied that, so I don't know what the thing was. But people do, there's no question that scientists make mistakes. And in fact, one of the features of science is that a scientific assertion is one that can be falsified by evidence. That's one of the features of what we call science. And when we discover evidence that shows that something we thought was correct is wrong, then that's great. I mean, we don't think that's a problem. That actually is an insight. And of course, if it affects how people have lived, then that's a mistake, and it is a mistake. But the point is, it's like the phrase, the race is not always to the swiftest, but that's how you should bet.
Yes.
That's how you should bet. And that's the thing is that science is not perfect, but for those topics that are studied by serious scientists, that is the best that humanity has been able to do so far in describing how the world works. And that's what we should rely on, because if you have to rely on something, and scientific investigation is quite good. Its track record is excellent.
Yes. And I think it's useful to point out, as you just did, that what you're trusting is not any particular person or any particular claim, but the scientific process and the constant peer review. On falsifiability too, I think it's worthwhile to drill down on that. So falsifiable is kind of the constant state of any kind of scientific assertion. It's meant to be hung out there for people to throw darts at and try to disprove.
That's right.
And the more failures there are at disproving it, the stronger the assertion becomes, but only because it resists those efforts to disprove it. Things that are not falsifiable, like, say, religious dogma, for example, that's not science. You can't say it's true or false, but it's not scientific.
That's correct.
Another question about mistakes. What we've just talked about is the perception side. So I see people who are authorities make mistakes, and therefore, should I trust them or not trust them? There's also a question on the demand side about people's willingness to admit mistakes. And I think that what you see a lot in so-called filter bubbles is that people are unwilling to admit mistakes, even when facts change, when their identity is challenged or some assumptions are challenged. Can you address that, and sort of what are the mental states you need to be able to get over that hurdle?
Yeah, and this is something that is learned and can be changed. One of the things that I do in my own actual classes, I'm teaching classes, and I one of the things that I try to help students learn is to be comfortable in being honest about their own state of understanding and non-understanding. So when I'm teaching an upper division mathematics class, I'll tell you the strategy I use. It's sort of fun, and I try to make it fun, by the way. So what I do is I give the students a set of, basically what they are is theorem statements, but they're challenges, and their challenge and their homework assignment is to personally prove all of these theorems that are carefully sequenced so that it's possible for them to do it, to prove on their own without asking any other help. I'm not going to help them. They're told not to look on the internet. They could, but they're told not to do that. They're not to talk with each other. And then they come to the class, and I say, John, Jane, Jose, you do number 12, and you three do number 13, you do number 14. Everybody's up at the blackboard explaining what they have figured out themselves to each other. And the effect is, and then they sit down, and I have the first group present what they did. The effect is that they make mistakes every day because they don't know how to do this. And by the way, you're saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, they're obviously going to look it up anyway, because they, that's what they're. That's not a problem. The reason it's not a problem is that then I just say, oh, how did you think of that? Oh, can you do this related thing? Oh, can you do this thing? And in about 10 seconds, you can easily see whether or not they did it themselves. So that is quickly off the table, and it's easy to get everybody to buy into this. and I advertise it as, this is going to change your life. And the way to change it is not to just look up things, but to try to figure them out on your own. So they make mistakes every single day. A person is going to be explaining, because if you are not an expert at something and you're trying to do something that's challenging, certainly in mathematics and I think in any other subject, you're going to make mistakes all the time. And I celebrate that. And I'll make sure somebody makes a mistake. And sometimes I'll have a person will do it correctly on the board, and I will have seen somebody else who got it wrong. And I'll say, oh, Joan, could you show yours? Because it was wrong. And then, Joan goes up and shows it, and we point out what was defective about that thinking, asking people to say, what is defective about that? And that's something to celebrate, because it's directive. It tells you what was wrong in your thinking. And that's a huge arrow pointing in the right direction, that you try some different direction. And so errors, having people react internally differently to mistakes and being willing to have that be a public part of reality, it's actually comforting. It means that you're not constantly saying, oh, did I make a mistake? Oh, it's terrible. No, that is part of the process of, certainly anything creative is built on the ash heap of failed attempts. If you are unwilling to make those failed attempts and learn from them, you're never going to do anything of great significance in my
Good. The old adage from show business that great plays are not written, they're rewritten.
Yeah.
So moving on to questions. So the third element, just asking questions, is now kind of a somewhat poisonous phrase. It's often kind of a snide preamble to promoting a conspiracy theory. So like, I'm just asking questions. How can you be sure, say, that vapor trails coming from airplane engines are not part of a plot to poison us? Just asking questions. It seems to me that kind of line of inquiry really comes down to sort of a question of authority versus sort of open-ended, not necessarily always in good faith inquiry. So where do you draw the line? When do you trust an authority, and when does a question become not really a legitimate question, I guess would be the way I'd phrase it.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I teach my students is doubt. And I'm for it, by the way. And what I tell people is that opinions, more or less about anything, should come with your own opinion on your own view of yourself. Should have the property that anything that you believe, an opinion or even a fact, should come with a percentage that tells you how strong you feel the evidence is for that particular opinion. And so I think it's very healthy, and I say it's sort of humorous because I can't imagine any politician actually doing this. But what I would love to see is to say, somebody says, well, I think the death penalty is really bad. You shouldn't have the death penalty. And then it should come with saying 80%. And then they hear a lecture, and the lecture says, well, I've studied the death penalty, and although it doesn't have a huge deterrent effect on committing murders, it actually does have some deterrent effect, and therefore you could argue that 50 people would not have been murdered if the death penalty had been in place in this. And then you say to yourself, oh, wow, that's pretty good. I think it's, morally I have problems with it, and there other countries don't do it, and I still don't like it, but that's evidence, and I see his point. Okay, now I'm 70% against that. You've changed. You would vote the same, but you've changed. And to me, having that sense of your own opinions is healthy, because you say, then I'm susceptible to evidence. And then you ask the question, well, what things should is it so strong that you shouldn't make ridiculous questions? And the answer is that's where you have this level of percent of confidence. In other words, if you have something if you take a rock and you let it go and you say, is it going to fall? Oh, I don't know. Maybe it's going to go, well, there's so much evidence that what's the percentage? It's basically 100%. So that is not a sensible thing to argue about. And also having people realize where the starting line is. This is basically Bayesian probability, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with Bayesian probability, but basically you start with a base sense of how the world is, and then evidence is used to adjust that base view. But if your base view is very high, in other words, if you are extremely confident of a particular thing, for example, let's say the efficacy of the COVID vaccines, and because you've seen evidence after evidence after evidence that it's extremely effective, then it would require a lot of counter evidence to say, oh, well, no, that's not true. Because, but if you got some counter evidence, you'd move it a little bit, but not a huge amount.
Right.
So thinking about what the base case is actually a very healthy thing to do in getting an understanding of the world.
Okay, good. What you've just outlined, I think of as the logical razor of, and I forget who it's attributed to.
Occam's razor. Yeah.
Well, Occam's razor is one, but there's another one that is basically, it says that extreme assertions require extreme evidence.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the question of flow of ideas and placing any idea at any given moment in time in an evolution from the past to the future. And you use in your book an analogy of New York, kind of constantly, the buildings in New York being constantly changing. I've also heard you use the buildings on that University of Texas campus as. Would you explain that sort of the landscape, the cityscape as a part of a flow?
Yeah. Well, so I'll use the University of Texas just because you're in New York, and so I'll use Texas. So the University of Texas is a big school, has a big campus. So it has maybe 300 buildings in the campus. So it's a large, it's like a whole city. So it has 300 buildings. And one thing that's extremely annoying is that often the roads are closed. There are construction going on. It's always annoying because there's noise and dirt and so on. Well, let's think about it. Any building lasts about 50 years, say, before it needs a major overhaul or actually torn down and another one built. So that means if you got 300 buildings, that means that 60 buildings a year, 6 buildings a year, 50 into 300. I should do a little better on that. 50 into 300 is 60 buildings a year, roughly, already on average need this huge renovation, which leads to road closures and noise and annoyance. So the fact is that the norm for existence is to be under construction in significant ways all the time. That's the norm. It's not the norm to have everything. You can sort of abstractly think, oh, well, the norm should be everything is going well. Mm-hmm. That's not the norm. The norm is among all of these features of our lives, and I use the buildings as a metaphor because all of us have all complicated lives. We have our health, we have our finances, we have our professions, we have our relationships with other people. There are lots of aspects of individual life. Well, it's nice to think the norm should be that everything's going great, but that's not the reality. The reality is that some things are, so to speak, under construction, and that lead to problems that we need to deal with. And that's the norm. And to me, it's comforting. It means that we don't have to be so, oh, geez, something went wrong. No, that's the norm. Accept it. It's like mistakes. If you have a different view of when you make a mistake and how to react to it, if you can be comfortable with it and realize that that's the norm, it doesn't mean that you don't if it's something that harms somebody, of course you feel bad about that. But on the other hand, you also realize that happens, and you take it with the appropriate thing, including making amends.
Mm-hmm.
It's more comforting if you realize, you know what, I'm going to make mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and these buildings are going to be under construction, and part of my life is going to be needing attention, and attention that I'd rather be doing something else with, and that and my backhand is going to miss from.
So let's apply that principle, that element, not just to tennis or to construction in Austin, but also to news media, if you
Yeah.
don't mind, then indulge me on that. So the industry is in turmoil. I think most people would say its business model that had sustained it for previous decades is challenged, and a lot of competition has arisen in a digital landscape. If you were to take that perspective you described earlier of sort of the 50-year look, how would you place today's media environment in the flow of norms from the past to the future?
Yeah. Well, and first of all, of course, this is not my area of expertise. So this is certainly an interesting moment in human history. To me, when I look at things like the media and the effect on human beings, and I think about these, horrific tragedy of 300,000 Americans dying of COVID because they didn't know how to appreciate reality, I view it as trying to come to an understanding of how the human brain works. That if we think of ourselves, and it's easy for us to think that, oh, I'm a completely autonomous being, and if I were brought up in a very conservative county in Texas or Florida, I would be a progressive person, and I would know that and that's not true. If we were born and put in those environments, if you sit and listen to Fox News every single day for all day long, it's the brain. Our human brains are susceptible to what we're told. And I like to think about how humans were like 30,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Or how people live, there are people living in Stone Age conditions, at least up to 50 years ago in Papua New Guinea, for example, who would completely without any worries go and just kill off somebody else in a neighboring tribe for no reason except they're not related, and that was just the norm. And people, it's just wrong to think that you or I would rise above that and have a different kind of opinion. So when I think of people who are being misled by inappropriate news sources, to me, it's a representation of how the human brain works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to be honest about that in how we take the further steps in how people are told things. And as I say, I'm not an expert at this at all, and you obviously know far more than I. But to me, the problem is that people don't seem to have there don't seem to be any consequences to saying things that are demonstrably false. If there were even just financial consequences for propagating just purely, clearly wrong statements, it seems to me there should be some sort of way to give disincentives. Whereas now the incentives of getting more people watching is so attractive. Apparently, people can make money and that kind of thing from just having people pay attention, regardless of whether what's being said is accurate. That seems to be something where maybe we need disincentives that are a little stronger.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that perspective, Michael. I didn't mean to put you on the spot talking about my industry, but yeah, there are many sort of pressure points or leverage points that algorithms could be changed so that you're not forced to look at things that either keep you confined to a particular filter bubble or are designed to outrage you or
Yeah.
make you
Well,
angry or things like that.
yeah, and I was reading a book about the future of AI, and one thing
Mm.
that they did these experiments I'm sure you're familiar with, where they ask an AI to optimize itself toward it, put it on social media and optimize the number of people who paid attention to it and the amount of time they spent on it. And within less than a day, it was spouting conspiracy theories and racist rants and so on, because that's what caused that, you know, um, you know, optimizing uh, people who are looking at paying attention. So I think this is a feature of the human mind and the human, what's attractive to people. People like, frankly, things that are bad. They like things that are um, you know they're rare and bad. And
Yes.
I mean, this is the problem with.
Yes. It is a human tendency that we could operate against rather than play into for
That's right.
profit.
But also, I mean, to me, accepting that that's a reality about human beings and then developing social practices that accommodate the reality. I mean, to me, reality is, it's not good or bad. It is what it
Hmm.
is.
Yes.
And then dealing with it in in an optimal way, deciding what your values are and then changing your structures in order to accommodate the reality of the way. We might wish that the human brain were better at distinguishing reality from bogus stuff and were more attracted to things that were true rather than false. If there were sort of a natural tendency to appreciate reality better than misinformation, that would be great. But if that's not the way the human mind actually works, then we should deal with the way it actually is.
Yes. Yeah. Let's wrap up by going to the fifth element, the one that
Yeah.
you have sometimes described as the quintessential one, about lifelong learning, constantly being open to change. Some of the research that I've seen in the misinformation field have pointed out that people who rate high on scores for being actively open-minded
Yeah.
are better at avoiding manipulation by false information than other people. Why is this so important to you?
Well, for one thing, I find it, what is life? What is it that we're doing here? And I think part of it is then one of the great joys of being a human being is that we are able to change, that we're able to grow, we're able to learn new things, we're able to become better at things. I think, when people say reach their potential, I don't I don't resonate with that, because I think we all have all kinds of possible ways that we can grow, and we can choose which directions we want to emphasize. And I just find that a fascinating, and
Mm.
and
Mm.
I just find joy in learning all kinds, and struggling with things. I love to, one of the things I try to teach my students is to enjoy productive struggle, to really like challenges. And to me, when I think about the challenges that we're facing and that we're talking about during these hours, the challenge about misinformation, the challenge about how to get people to become more able to distinguish reality from bogus information, and I think, well, yeah, these are huge challenges. I like challenges, and some of the challenges that our predecessors have had, like trying to survive, saber-toothed tigers that are attacking us. I'm thinking maybe the challenge of misinformation is one. Let's embrace that challenge. It could be worse. It could be worse.
It could be worse.
But but
Uh,
but but to me, it is part of it is effective education. That
mhm.
if you can get a person to love learning, I mean, to me, that's one of the reasons I don't like the phrase, critical thinking. I like effective thinking better, because critical sounds negative.
Mm.
To be critical, to find fault. Well,
Mhm.
finding fault, that's one and an important strategy for understanding the world. But there are many more positive strategies, such as loving to learn. That is a positive thing. It's not critical thinking, but it is something that can allow you to constantly be looking around at our own world and saying, what can I learn about that? How can I I can become more accurate in my appreciation of the way the world works. So we're in for a treat. No.
Well, we definitely face a challenge here,
We do.
but I am delighted that we could end on a question that that your answer led by saying, "What is the meaning of life? What are we doing here on Earth?" That is a great send off, and also the optimistic note. And I appreciate you. Thank you for being on In Reality. Thank you for the work you do at Texas too. I appreciated being a student of yours just for this hour.
Eric, you were very kind. Thank you so much for having me, and I wish you the very best of luck in being as successful as humanly possible in the work that you're doing. And that I feel like you and I are doing the same work. We're trying to help human beings to become better able to appreciate our world. Thank you.
All right. That's it for this episode of In Reality. My thanks to Michael Starbird for reminding us that the antidote to misinformation isn't censorship, but rather discipline. The discipline to return to fundamentals, to learn from mistakes, to question, to understand context, and most of all, to remain open to changing your mind. In Reality is a production of the Alliance for Trust in Media. It's produced by Tom Platz of Sound Sapien and Meg Talikoff of the Alliance. You can learn more about our work at alliancefortrust.com. And if you value what we're doing, please rate us and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with someone you trust. I'm Eric Schurenberg. Thanks for listening.